Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being part of this virtual event. I'm Walid Hejazi, and I'm an Associate Professor of Economic and Policy Analysis at the Rotman School of Management. Welcome to the sixth webinar in our weekly webinar series, Managing Uncertainty, Adapting to and Learning from the COVID-19 Crisis. Each week, our goal is to bring together the Rotman community and offer our evidence-based perspectives and advice to help you cope with the dramatic changes that are taking place as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we want to talk about pandemic protectionism, the global trade impact of COVID-19. Over the past 3 or 4 years, Canadians have had to deal with the great threat of renegotiation of the NAFTA and the potential economic implications. Thankfully, the renegotiation of the NAFTA has happened and a lot of that uncertainty has been resolved, sort of. Now, in the midst of this pandemic and the resulting dramatic economic contraction, there's concern about global supply chains and the ability, or perhaps inability, of Canada, the United States, and many European countries to scale up production and to procure supplies of critical medical equipment, including testing kits, ventilators, masks, and so on. This has resulted in intense discussion, often very emotional, on the need to bring production back to domestic markets. That is, there's pressure on global trading system as we know it. And there's so much at play here, including many underlying motivations and trends with many implications for the global economy. We've brought together 2 leading global thinkers to take us through a discussion of the geopolitical impact of the COVID-19 crisis on international trade and supply chains. Chad Bown is Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. His research examines international trade laws and institutions, trade negotiations, and trade disputes. Chad co-hosts a weekly podcast on the economics of international trade policy called Trade Talks. For those of you interested in international trade, I really encourage you to check these out. They're really, really interesting. Chad is a highly sought after speaker and leading thinker on international trade and global supply chains. Dan Trefler is the J. Douglas and Ruth Canada Research Chair in Competitiveness and Prosperity at the Rotman School of Management and Senior Research Fellow at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Studies. Dan is an internationally renowned trade economist known for his path-breaking contributions to fundamental research. The research has been instrumental in the design and pursuit of trade agreements that promote productivity, innovation, and investment while minimizing the harmful effects on workers and the most disadvantaged. In recent years, he's advised Global Affairs Canada on national policies towards foreign investment and helped frame the document that launched Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. So welcome to both of you. Now, for today,
good to see you.
Hi,
Chad.
Hi, Chad. Hope you're doing well in Washington. I'm going to break up the conversation today into 3 buckets. The first, we want to talk about supply chains and what they are and what they mean. Secondly, we'll pivot and talk about the need for more international cooperation. And then third, we'll have a segment near the end where we'll answer questions. But everyone online, please submit your questions as we go through, and I'll try to weave them into the conversation as we go through this hour. So Dan, let me begin with you. Can you explain to the audience what is meant by a global supply chain, what these mean for business, what they mean for the average listener? That is, why should they care about changes to the status quo as it relates to global supply chains?
Hey, Walid. Well, thanks for asking me. Turns out to be a super tough question. So good start. I don't want to start defining and quantifying global value chains and explain to you, how nerds like me come up with numbers like 52% of all world trade is through global value chains. I think that would be a little overwhelming, but really at the heart of a GVC, a global value chain, is not a chain, but a web of firm-to-firm supply relationships. And I don't want to emphasize the word relationships. I mean, these relationships can take many forms, like GM owning its production facility in Querétaro in Mexico, or Apple having a long-term, high-value relationship with contract manufacturing in China, like it's with Foxconn. or Toronto General Hospital having a very short-term relationship with an N95 supplier in China, and the TGH always searching for a new and sort of a lower cost supplier. Well, in normal times, firms are really very good at deciding how much to invest in building out these GVC relationships, these global value chain relationships. And the result has been sort of a relentless push to squeeze out costs from the system, which are then passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices, right? So as a result, a typical industrialized country is about 5% richer. This is the numbers that we come out of many, many studies. For Canada, that would mean that we're, roughly speaking, we're about $40 billion richer each year. It's a lot of money. This is a really big benefit for Canada. So there are real benefits to building out these GVCs, and globalization per se is, it's not the devil wearing Prada. I get that the Prada is being produced in a sweatshop in Guangzhou, and we want to worry about that, but this is not, the devil is behind globalization. So, while GVCs function well in normal times, in times of crisis, we know that these deeper relationships are the ones that really function well. Unfortunately, I think firms and public institutions have systematically underinvested in key relationships involving PPE, ventilators, the reagents, and other chemicals that we need in our medical devices for testing and vaccines. And it just raises this question for me, at least, why is this? And why is it so important now? Because we've certainly seen other supply disruptions, right? Walid, you'll remember 2011 tsunami, and Chad, that you've heard of this thing called the 2019 Trump tariffs. Trump, the best writing on this subject, by the way, absolutely the best is what Chad writes. Great columns, great podcasts. So I think that there are two things that are different about the current crisis. Maybe Chad and Walid have some additional ones, but there's two things that really explain our collective failure to deal with this pandemic more effectively. I think the first is, and this is really fundamental, the social cost of failed supply chains, the social cost, the cost to society, it's just much higher than the private cost to individual firms. So, a tsunami that delays the delivery of cars by 6 months, that's not socially costly. But a pandemic that delays the delivery of PPE by 6 months, well, that imposes huge societal costs. We must cope, with the death of our loved ones. Unfortunately, I'm sure that there are many who are listening in that have had that unfortunate experience. That, we're all coping with the social isolation that seems to have no fixed end date. We're having firms and workers that are suffering unprecedented economic hardship. So there are many ways in which these hardships could have been lessened, but all of them start by recognizing a simple market failure. That the benefits of building long-term supply relationships for PPEs, et cetera, are much higher for society than they are for individual firms. And that leads to a very simple conclusion. There's an important role for government. And this is something that nobody is talking about, but it really has to be stated. Unfortunately, not only did private firms fail us, but not only did governments failed us because they weren't adequately prepared, but I have to say that we bear some of the responsibility personally as voters, because as voters, we failed our government by not being sufficiently demanding of our very capable public officials. We've become very narrow in our view of what the appropriate role for government is, and we've become overly skeptical of the ability of government to execute on its mandates. And what we ended up with is a government that we wanted, a government that was not sufficiently engaged in managing our supply chains for these critical goods. So that's the first issue, that there's this big market failure, that it's more valuable to society to manage these supply chains than to individual firms. And the second one is a little bit more technical. It's that the current crisis is a little different than past crises. In past crises, the shocks were often idiosyncratic. They hit a single country, like a tsunami hits Japan. But the current crisis, the shocks are correlated across countries. And that has important implications when we're dealing with GVCs. And it is a way to think about it. There's sort of two models of, and this is my last point. There's two models of how the world functions. in the first, each country does its own thing. It builds everything it needs, and it doesn't rely on any other countries. And when we think about that world, sort of harkens back to an old time when, the first settlers arrived in Canada and suffered the winters and planted their crops. And they were very, I think the word we use, they were very resilient. Shocks came and went. They managed to survive and get by. There's another model. And this one is in which we are in highly integrated societies, in which each country depends on the other country. This is the model of globalization, which we squeeze out all these efficiency gains, in which we're obsessed with efficiency. So we have two models of the world, one which emphasizes the advantages of resiliency and one which emphasizes the advantages of efficiency. And here's the key point, is that when we have shocks that are idiosyncratic to individual countries, like a tsunami in Japan, this efficiency model of globalization works very well. But when it's correlated across countries, then this efficiency model stops working very well, and the resiliency model is the one that works better.
Thank you for that, Dan, and that gives us a really helpful perspective to think about global supply chains and when they work and when they don't. So, Chad, maybe I could ask you, in the current environment, there are many calls to change global supply chains to somehow bring back production to Canada, the US, and other Western markets. Dan talked about the trade-offs here, but in your assessment, are these calls to bring back global supplies, are they well-founded, or are they driven by Navarro politics or solid sort of business, public health concerns?
So first, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a tremendous pleasure. This is a huge question. I think a lot of it is sort of knee-jerk reaction, people being scared, policymakers saying to themselves, we need to deal with this a crisis, the things that we can control now. We can't trust anybody but sort of ourselves. And I think that's sort of the knee-jerk reaction. But I think in a lot of respects, it's actually the wrong reaction and can be kind of counterproductive. And so let me go a little bit further into some of the points that Dan made. One of the things that I've spent the last 2 months studying in far too much depth is what the supply chains and trade flows in things like, this personal protective equipment, the PPEs, the masks, and hospital gowns and all of that kind of stuff comes from. At least in the United States, we import a lot of that from China. We get some of it from Mexico as well. Some of it is regional. I know we have, we're part of a supply chain with you all as well. But a lot of this we were buying from China, importing from China. And really what happened with this outbreak was very much kind of a perfect storm of events. So for one, there was already a bit of a supply chain disruption that was happening that was completely unrelated to the coronavirus outbreak, but because of the trade war. But because of the trade war, the Trump administration had imposed tariffs on respirators and surgical masks in 2019, already making it more difficult for American hospitals, at least, and medical providers to be able to purchase this equipment from China, the world's largest, the Americans' largest source of foreign supply of these things. And, my sense is the hospital systems hadn't quite worked that out. They hadn't figured out who the alternative suppliers should be, if they should continue buying from China, but just at higher prices. So we were already at a bit of stage of disruption of a supply chain, lack of adequate preparedness, and then this shock hit, right? And then the shock hits kind of in the worst possible way. It starts off in China, which is the largest supplier of a lot of this equipment. And obviously China's natural reaction is to, have huge demand for this equipment for itself, to try to, back in January, it was the only place suffering from this. So it had a huge increase in the need for respirators and masks. It ramped up production as quickly as it could, but it needed a lot of this stuff internally, and that meant fewer exports available for the rest of the world as well. And so you had kind of this perfect storm of events, all taken, some of it self-inflicted. I think the trade war, you could argue, was self-inflicted, but but the events sort of taking place in China itself is originating in China, and thus making it more difficult for the rest of the world to be able to access some of these supplies when they needed it, when sort of COVID ended up on their shores, created problems. So that then leads us to the question of, well, you know, how should we think about this then? Is it maybe a better solution would be to, you know, not have these supply chains? Let's forget for a moment kind of other political, geostrategic challenges that you might have with being particularly reliant on China. But, you know, let's just suppose that we did all of this ourselves in the United States, or you did all of it yourself there in Canada. And I think the evidence has shown that outcome doesn't work either. And, you know, my favorite example, I don't know what you're going through there in Canada, but, you know, for the first 6 weeks, the sort of favorite story was our shortage of toilet paper here in the United States. Everybody's at home, and everybody wants to buy, you know, the very comfortable, nice, cushy toilet paper, but none of it's available. And the story behind that is it's effectively a supply chain story, not an international global supply chain story, but essentially there's two different types of toilet paper being produced out there. There's stuff that, you know, for your office, commercial, public, it's very uncomfortable, nobody wants it. And then there's the home stuff. And the massive shift from the commercial to the home meant that there was just not enough of the home stuff available. There was lots of the other stuff available, but this then, you know, is sort of a lean supply chain story, but it has nothing to do with international trade, nothing to do with cross-border, nothing to do with China. It's just a massive shift in demand. And there's sort of no amount of preparedness that could have left us ready for that kind of outcome. So I think it's you know, it presents politicians that might have ulterior motives with saying, we need to bring supply chains back. But I don't think that is the solution. I think we have seen, you know, other examples would be in the United States, we've had to shut down a lot of meat packing facilities for pork and beef, because that's where they've had outbreaks of the pandemic showing up for workers. Imagine those had been not meat packing plants, but those had been N95 respirator plants, right? Then we'd be desperate for that kind of material to come in from abroad, from countries that weren't suffering right at this moment. So I think it is a bit of a wrong reaction in terms of policy to think that the solution is going to be to say, let's bring back supply chains to only be here in our own country.
Yeah, I think that's a super valuable point, that the supply chain disruptions initially manifested as international, but now we're going to see the domestic. And what are we going to do? Say that New York should not trade with Idaho? I mean,
yeah, so taking it to the limit. So, you know, Dan, you've often talked about the gift of disruption, and this year is sort of a big disruptive event, getting lots of people thinking about, you know, political changes, but also strategic changes for corporations. How should firms be thinking about this in the age of COVID?
That's a great one, and this is sort of a different mind shift, because I think for most of us it's crisis mode, blame mode, let's hunker down and just survive mode. But you know, I've talked to now in the last several weeks to dozens and dozens of startups, and seen what is happening in the newspapers as well. And it's extraordinary how in the midst of this crisis there are many firms that are seeing this as a great opportunity. And it sounds almost cliche, right, Walid? But we all know the Chinese character for crisis is actually two characters, right? Danger and opportunity. So I'm looking around, I'm seeing these many, many opportunities. And if I'm in business, I want to ask, what opportunities are there for me? This is not all a disaster. Some of this is opportunity. So telehealth, which has languished for a decade, right? You know, people invested in telehealth, like Bernie Pell, for 10 years sits languishing. And now, you know, it's unbelievable what's happening to his portfolio. Why? Because it's a hot item. Doctors are using telehealth to triage patients so they don't have to come into hospital. Psychiatrists are doing the unthinkable, the absolute unthinkable. Nobody thought that psychiatry could be done online. And lo and behold, we're doing it online and the psychiatrists are thrilled with it. Remote meetings. Nobody thought that we could, in the course of a weekend, take Rotman School of Management and turn it from an in-location, face-to-face classroom experience to a fully and completely online experience. Nobody thought we could do it. I'm sorry to sound like Trump. Nobody thought. We and many others did that transition in 72 hours. And now all of us are thinking remote meetings, right? We all realize that we're much more focused when we're at home. We're much more comfortable not having to take that 15-hour flight to Guangzhou. Oh my gosh, if I ever have to take that flight again. And we're now focused on, the things that are more important to us rather than these distractions like traveling. So what does remote meetings mean for different types of companies? And then there's all this other stuff that we could be doing. Like you see opportunities everywhere. There's 2 sterilization companies that my students from my class in Rotman are working with. That's just my students, for heaven's sakes. The Spartan testing that's come out of U of T, the vaccines, the clinical trials that Canada could take advantage of. There's so many opportunities out there, and you have to ask as a company, can I take advantage of disruptive change? We're doing it at Rotman in ways that we never imagined, and we're a public company, right? We're government. So surely your private company can do better. Your company should be reimagining its future. And you have to remember that reimagining your company and then sort of implementing will require a bet, right? A bet against the future. You don't know for sure that this is going to work, but you got to at least consider trying. And, all that market research can help you shorten your odds. But in the end, a truly innovative strategy that's going to propel you into a new space, it's going to be a risky one, but you need to be thinking in those terms.
So Dan, you talked about these 2 models, one based on efficiency and resilience. Now you're talking about all of this innovation. So Chad, I'll put you on the spot and say, will the crisis lead to a rethink of global value chains? What do you think?
I do think that the combination of both this crisis and the sort of the relentlessness of the trade war, which for all intents and purposes wasn't going away, even before the crisis hit. There was an agreement between the United States and China, but most all of the tariffs that the 2 sides had imposed on each other throughout the trade war were still in place, and there was very much the sense that this might just be a political deal, for the Trump administration to campaign on, for the president to campaign on before November. And so, with that in mind, I think companies that were very focused globally, at least in Asia, were already thinking about what that would mean for their supply chains, and whether it's resiliency or redundancy, or restructuring things in light of the fact that both policy might change in ways that they hadn't anticipated before 2016, or now certainly the size of this crisis, and how quickly it spread, and how even once we wrap our hands around it and resolve it, something like this, could easily happen again. Yes, I think it won't be the end of globalization. It won't be the end of supply chains, but I think companies are going to have to think about things quite differently than they had recently.
So a question just came in, which I'd like to ask now, but it's very much related to what you just said, Chad. Should we reconsider our industrial policies in Canada and the US to be selectively protective when it comes to certain goods like PPE, ventilators, and food supply? How would you respond to that question?
So I think there are definitely going to be calls to do this. I think a big question, I think one of the big concerns that I've had in terms of how government and policymakers have behaved during the crisis so far is that there has been a stunning lack of cooperation and coordination globally.
Yes.
Where you sit in Canada is one of the few places that is thinking outside of your national borders at the moment. We saw early on in Europe in March, infighting between EU member states for PPE. The Germans and the French requisitioned the respirators and masks and wouldn't even sell it to Italy, the part of Europe in the European Union that was suffering the most at that point in time. In the United States, in April, the Trump administration invoked the Defense Production Act and said, we're not going to sell this stuff to Canada. Eventually, they backed off and changed that, but that was a real big concern for a while. So I think, given that those kinds of policies have taken place, there is definitely going to be an incentive for national governments to say, look, we need to worry about preparing ourselves, our people better. I don't think, for the reasons that we've talked about, that's the best way to handle it, because I think any of these shocks can happen at the national level as well, and no one's immune. I think a better approach is to build up stockpiles, strategic reserves, more information. Right now, one of the big problems is we know nothing about production, how much anybody can produce of this type of equipment, how much is being stored, what consumption is. We have a little bit of information and a lag about trade, but without that information, it really does breed distrust and a sort of a lack of cooperation. We saw the same thing happen back in 2008, 9, 10 during the financial crisis when it came to food, not in the rich countries, but especially in the developing world, when there were lots of there's a commodity price spike and there were shortages of food. A lot of that stemmed from lack of information. And so what happened then is that G20 put forward a new monitoring system for key food crops to try to help resolve those types of problems. This might be another example for things like PPE and ventilators and all these kinds of critical equipment, the drugs, the vaccines, the therapeutics. Once we get there, we just need much more information so that countries and governments are comfortable engaging and cooperating with each other, and we don't necessarily push toward this more nationalistic approach.
Maybe if I could just ask you, and then I'll come to you, Dan, but if you think about after 2008, it was a very different in terms of international cooperation versus today. What is it going to take to get us back to a situation where there's a lot more international trust, international cooperation, rather than sort of a more unilateral approach, especially by the United States?
Yeah, well, I think on the United States side, unfortunately, it's going to take a different administration. This administration just has no interest. We've seen over the last 3 years how they've treated the World Trade Organization, outside of trade, what they've done on climate, what they've done toward Iran, and breaking deals that had been implemented. So I don't think you're going to see any leadership coming out of the Americans, unfortunately, when it comes to thinking about global cooperation and coordination. And I do think this is a big problem. I think the next concern, that we potentially face once we get beyond this initial phase of the health concerns with the crisis is, when we start to begin to reopen our economies again, and trade flows begin to start to resume, and that starts to happen on an asynchronous basis, and we start to see, China or Asia opening before we do here, or Europe, there may be calls for protection. And back in 2008, 2009, you had the group of 20, the leaders of all the major economies came forward and said, we're not going to do any of that kind of stuff. The leaders, the presidents, the prime ministers, they all agreed to not do that kind of stuff. We're not seeing any of that being taken up today. We're seeing smaller initiatives, including a number that have been taken by Canada, with other kind of smaller open economies, with the Australias, the New Zealands of the world. But unfortunately, largely absent from a lot of those. The United States is entirely absent, but also missing is frequently Europe and even China. So I think that's something that's very different today that I find at least worrisome.
Yeah. So Dan, maybe I can ask you what your take is. Go ahead.
Just to add two things to what Chad was saying. The person who asked the question said industrial policy. They sort of elevated what is really a relatively minor intervention in a really circumscribed set of goods to using language to suggest that this is an industrial policy. This isn't an industrial policy. This is very precisely targeted interventions. This is, when you say industrial policy, it makes it sound like, oh, we shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers, and this is not the place for government. It is the place for government. It's not industrial policy. It's not picking winners. There's nothing ideological here. That's the first thing. So we've got to take the high ground on language here. It's nothing about industrial policy. The second thing is to just to say how much I agree with Chad that in the end, we are in between a rock and a hard place right now with international cooperation. And it is not in Canada's interest, and I believe it's not in the interest of any country, including China and the United States, to continue the state of affairs. And we are going to have to find as many touchstones as possible for international cooperation. And maybe as we go along in this discussion, we can rattle off another dozen.
When we spoke earlier, Dan, you told me to be positive. So I'm going to ask you, what's your outlook? Do you feel optimistic?
Do I feel optimistic? There's a short and long run of this. So in the short run, I'm an economist, and I have a good sense of the importance of what I do. And yet, in the short run, we are still pinned down by science. And that is, we still have very unclear ideas about how this disease unfolds. We don't know how many people have it, how long they have it for, how long they shed the virus. We don't know what the false negatives on testing. We don't know what the vaccine is going to look like. We don't know the production, the time it takes to produce 7 billion vaccines. There's so much science that we don't understand. My role, I feel, as an economist is to recognize that the most important thing right now is the science of it, to make sure it's well funded. That, I'm not either optimistic or pessimistic. I just think we need to be reminded that there is a fundamental epidemiological issue here, and I trust the scientists to do as best they can, much more than I trust the private sector to just rattle off solutions which get them grants from governments.
Okay.
In the long run, am I optimistic? Of course, Walid. There are so many opportunities here, and this will transform the world to a better place, I hope.
And before I go to a question to Chad, there's just one question, and we've already touched on it, but I think this is an MBA student looking for a stock tip is really what it is. But as a result, after we get a vaccine, do you see manufacturing in Canada, in the US, somehow surging or changing the trajectory it was on before? What are your thoughts on that? Chad, Dan?
For manufacturing a vaccine, absolutely. I think this is one of the big concerns. And I agree with Dan too. I think our job as economists is to try to explain to folks the trade-offs and then get out of the way and let the scientists do their job and kind of help us get through this. My big concern, while I'm a long-run optimist as well, my big concern at the moment with the current political frameworks is that we could see nationalism showing up next, when it comes to things like vaccines. And so, us producing here in the United States, but only for us, other countries perhaps doing the same thing as well. So yes, I do see manufacturing of that kind of thing taking place. Do I see a major change in the manufacturing economy in the United States because of this? Again, not really, kind of the general trends in manufacturing, maybe some production, but the general trends in manufacturing in terms of employment with technology, it's just, it's never going to go back to the way things were in the 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s, I think.
That's a really important message. And I think a lot of people somehow think, maybe spurred on by Trump, thinking that they could bring back the manufacturing economy. One sort of thread through some of these questions, I'd like you each just to, to think maybe in the US and in Canada, might the rise of nationalism, particularly in the US, impact immigration flows to an extent more than what we've already seen? Because we've already seen it in the US. Maybe Dan, you can start in Canada. Do you see any backlash on immigration?
I do. We're not speaking about this, and it needs to be talked about. The first thing that's going to happen, I suspect, is we're going to have to confront what we do with the temporary workers program over the summer, because those temporary workers, 50% from Mexico, with Guatemala and Jamaica taking up a big piece of the rest of it. They're the ones that pick the crops that are going to be essential for our supply chain. If we don't have those workers, we're going to have to rethink how we deliver food to Canadians. So that's going to be the first wake-up call to Canadians about exactly how dependent we are and thankful we are for that temporary workers program. Then we're going to, I suspect, my view is that immigration should be something which is pro-cyclical, not counter-cyclical. So, but that, this is largely, I think, a political rather than an economic decision. But on a pro-cyclical, I think we need to take a pause and ask ourselves at a time when we have scared. Let me step this back. My view has always been, we need immigration in Canada. It's been extremely positive. But when we bring somebody to Canada, we have an absolute responsibility to make sure that immigrant is well integrated into Canadian society. And that is cost initially resources. We get paid back for it in spades later on, but it initially costs resources. In a downturn, we may not have the resources for that. So I'm a little concerned in the short run. Doesn't mean that we have to have a long run when we think of immigration policy, but I think we need to be prepared for the fact that if we can't, roll out the red carpet, right, and which we must for our immigrants, then we need to be a little bit, sparing in the short run.
Chad, maybe you can give us an American perspective?
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with that. I think we're already seeing signs of it, getting worse in the United States in terms of shutting borders. And obviously, I think we have an even bigger reliance on temporary workers for agriculture, in our sector, especially California. So I think this is going to be very, very problematic over the next couple of months.
Yeah. So Chad, I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked many times before. I've never asked it in the context of the COVID crisis, and you've kind of touched on it before, but I'd like to sort of to get you to answer this question directly. Ed Luce from the Financial Times wrote a book called The Retreat of Western Liberalism, where he talks about this thing called the Snapback. And I think many people in Canada, many people on this webinar somehow believe that if Donald Trump were to lose the next election and a Democrat, Joe Biden, were to win, somehow life would go back to normal. Luce speculated in his book that this would not happen, that the US had fundamentally changed, and Trump was in some sense a reflection, not just the cause of it. Not sure if you agree, but as a result of this pandemic, what do you foresee? Would a change in government in the US, would that be enough to get us back to where we were before, or do you see there's some significant changes that have occurred?
Okay. So I guess how far back is a big question. Is it just as far back as where we were in December, or are we talking back in 2016? I think in the United States right now, if we want to stop and talk for a moment about China and US-China relations, there is very bipartisan concerns with China. And I think you've already started to see that with the Biden campaign. I think we're going to see it get worse, the rhetoric from both candidates between now and November, who can be seen to be, tougher on China, saying worse things about China. And that's going to be difficult to pivot from, if candidate Vice President Biden were to win in November. I think a different policy approach toward China might evolve under a Biden administration than if the Trump administration has a second term. You would probably see more global cooperation with other countries, with Canada, with Europe, with Japan, many whom obviously have similar concerns with China, whether it be on the trade side and concerns about subsidies and state-owned enterprises, intellectual property rights protection, those kinds of things, or it's other more geostrategic or human rights. There might be, I would expect there would be more of a willingness to collaborate and to use alternative forum to engage like-minded, similar valued countries with the American approach that would be quite different from what we've seen from the Trump administration over the last 3 years. So on China, same sentiment, but probably a different strategy. Yeah, but with COVID, let me just one point on COVID and then I'll stop. That's I think another, sort of monkey wrench in the works. The big question is, is this sort of a new 9/11, which just causes the United States in a bipartisan way to look extremely inward for a period of time? I'm like Dan, I'm an optimist. I think this crisis has presented us with opportunities to fight some of the, global challenges. Now that we've been confronted this one, we can maybe double down on our efforts on climate and other things too. But I'm worried. I'm not yet sure what the future holds for sort of the American sentiment on these topics.
Yeah, I would add, because I so agree with Chad, as I have so often not only agreed but been informed by in the past. Walid, we get a little confused about what Trump means as a word. It means two things. One, we all agree that something has to be done that changes the relations between Western countries and China. Everybody agrees. The Chinese agree, the West agrees. Trump was perhaps the most clear to the public about that, though Obama had been doing lots of stuff in the background before Trump came around. What we've conflated is the goal, which many of us agree on, and Biden agrees on, and Xi Jinping agrees on, with how we get there. And this is the problem with Trump. It's how we get there. For him, we get there by abandoning the institutions that have created so much success for us, both domestically and internationally, where the US has taken the lead on institution building around the world. The approach the administration has taken is confrontational, to tear down international institutions like the WTO. Instead of negotiating against China immediately, they start to fight with Canada, then they start to fight with with the EU, and then a little bit with Japan. When what they should have been doing, instead of renegotiating NAFTA, was creating a coalition around the world to rethink the China relationship. And it should have been institution building, not institution destroying. That's what Trump has been so ineffective at.
Yeah. And a question just came in related, and you're both officially optimists. I've written that down because you both have said that. But thinking optimistically, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit for establishing greater international cooperation and coordination? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, lots. And I know Chad has too.
Go ahead, you start, Dan.
Okay. First of all, the WTO has to be fixed. Everybody agrees it has to be fixed. The US has killed the WTO by destroying the appellate body, which is the crown jewel of the system. So we need international cooperation to fix the WTO. China has come to the table to, I don't like their proposals, but they're at least at the table to discuss fixing the WTO. The United States is not. The United States has to come to the table. And there's ways of doing that. Chad will know even better than I some of the ways that are already happening. But beyond that, the opportunity that this crisis presents is, instead of the mudslinging and blame throwing, the blame game that we're playing, we could move on to think about all the constructive things. And this is why I think Bill Gates has been so well received in the news, because it is a positive story that he's trying to present to us. He's saying, look, there is all this stuff that we could be doing. To coordinate on healthcare internationally. We have this WHO R&D blueprint that's been advocated. Trump, of course, underfunding the WTO. We have the International Severe Acute Respiratory. We have the Emerging Infection Consortium. We have a global research collaboration. The Canadian government has given $1 billion to an EU-led initiative to take us through the whole process of dealing with pandemics, ultimately to producing vaccines. This is a moonshot. This is putting a man on the moon. And instead of this being a race between, the Sputnik and the Americans and later the Chinese and the Indians, instead of this being who can get there fastest, this can be how can the whole world get there fastest. That's a message that resonates across race, across religion, across borders. That's a message that Canadians are pushing, and I would like to see, I would love to see that as being a launch pad for a great global moonshot, which is the elimination of global pandemics.
Okay, Chad?
I think the only thing that I would add is sometimes folks like Dan and I are challenged by, being able to convince it's worth funding, sinking the time and effort and resources into pursuing these really, really important ideas, because, the world doesn't know what the counterfactual is, how bad things would get if we don't do that. Well, we've had a lot of experiences now about what happens when we don't do the right thing and just how scary it is and where it is that we end up. So I think hopefully people will be, certainly Americans will do a lot of self-reflection and say, wow, the last couple of years, that's not great. We don't want to have that happen again. Let's figure out the right way to build institutions, to cooperate, to make sure that kind of thing, that we can really learn the lessons that we need to take away from that whole experience.
So the importance of international cooperation is really important. But another question very much related to this, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer it, but if you think about sort of international cooperation to try to come up with a vaccine, what happens if one particular country gets the vaccine first? How do we ensure how that gets distributed globally? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Jack, do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I'm thinking about at the moment and trying to write something down. And so if your folks have ideas, please tell them to me so that I can steal their intellectual property. Okay. So one I think why it's critical is obvious, right? That case doesn't need to be even really made. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. There's humanitarian reasons, et cetera. So it doesn't need to be explained. That being said, the concern is that once some country comes up with a vaccine, they're going to hoard it and they're going to nationalize it. I think one way that you can kind of prevent that from happening is by leveraging and taking advantage and realizing the benefits of these supply chains. So, in all likelihood, suppose we get, that we come up with the vaccine first in the United States, or you do in Canada. We're probably not going to have all of the inputs we need locally to be able to scale up that vaccine production quickly. We're going to need to import stuff from the rest of the world, whether it be, the vials or the caps or the active pharmaceutical ingredients or other things that we need to be able to do it. That should be, a mechanism to force countries to keep themselves open, to live up to a deal that says, if I promise to make some of this available to the rest of the world, once I, start making it, that I'm gonna actually follow through with that promise. So I'm thinking that, supply chains, the existence of these supply chains could actually be a force that we can leverage to make sure that we continue seeing cooperation where it might not otherwise emerge.
Dan,
you buy that, Dan?
That's going to be helpful. I think we need to go further. We're going to have to, as Walid will know, I am a strong believer that the US patent system has gone out of whack and is way too protective. I am concerned that China is eventually going to move in that direction when it suits their purposes. That is, when they're producing the vaccines themselves. But right now, what China does, at least in this area of medicines, is what I think many countries should be doing, and that is compulsory licensing. That is to say to big US pharmaceutical companies, no, we're not going to pay outrageous prices for pharmaceutical products that you develop. Those companies will then say, well, we're not going to develop the products anymore. At which point we will say to them, that's okay. Because frankly, most of the development happens within universities. All that pharmaceutical big pharma does these days is take products through clinical trials. They don't develop the drugs anymore. Like we can go through a list of all the major drugs, blockbuster drugs, and realize that they were developed in universities. What we need to do is recognize this, offer the alternative to drug manufacturers. Do you want to participate at a much reduced profit to yourselves? Or do you want to hand off some of this to the government? Let the government own all of these major vaccines that are developed at the public purse by universities. And as we're going to discover, I suspect, I'm not certain of this, we're going to discover that to produce 7 billion doses of a vaccine on short order is going to require resources that no single country can command, and that universities and other research institutes are going to be, recruited for. So to me, as long as we can get past this ideology that the US intellectual property rights system is the right model for the world, it is not, that's a consensus among economists that it's not. If we can get past that, then we can start to see that cooperation is possible.
Okay, Chad, would you like to add anything, or are you good?
No, I think that's good.
Good. So we're coming up, the last 8 minutes or so, and I initially was going to say, I'm going to ask you a big ideas question, but there's been so many big ideas. I'm going to ask you another big idea question, and maybe I could ask Chad to think about the US and Dan to think about Canada. The stimulus packages that have been rolled out in Canada and US are truly historic. We're estimating that the Canadian budget deficit might be $200 billion, considering the government debt is only $500 or $600 billion. That's a big number. And in the US, 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3, these are big numbers. There's this idea that in 3 months or 6 months, when these stimulus packages run out, economies are still going to be weak, and they're going to have to be replaced with something. It's unlikely the US or Canadian governments are somehow going to pull back all of this stimulus and replace it with nothing. They will replace it with something. The question is what? So if I were to ask you, if you were advising government, sort of big ideas about, what's this, and Dan, you talked a few years ago about nation building ideas, these big ideas. What kind of big idea do you think the government should put in its mind when it thinks about the next stimulus packages that are definitely coming? Should it be more spending that we see now, or should it be more focused on some kind of a vision you have? So I'm not sure who wants to go first, Chad or Dan. Chad for the US, maybe?
So I'll be honest with you. I'm a trade economist, and I'm not a macroeconomist, and so this isn't where I normally spend a lot of my intellectual space. But what I can do is to think about how this is going to be hard. And so our normal thinking would be, early in this crisis, we've gone, to try to protect workers and to try to just get money to people, right? To deal with the short-term problems that the people are going to have. Eventually, we're going to get to the stage of trying to re-engage the economy again. And so if there's going to be, government spending programs, I remember back in 2008, 2009, in the United States, it was the shovel-ready programs, right? And so there's always infrastructure. We need in the United States? Better infrastructure. The problem, though, is that going to be right this time around? Physical infrastructure, is that going to be safe? Right? Is that going to be accounting for all the social distancing needs and where we are? And what treatments and what testing that we have available at that moment in time. This is going to be really, really tricky. This is going to require policymakers that are nimble and flexible and some really creative economic advisors. And I hope you have them there in Canada. I will say here in the United States, we're not seeing a lot of this right now. I think this is a big worry. So this is definitely worth thinking hard about. I don't have any obvious silver bullet solutions right now, but I do think this is going to be the big challenge that we're going to face over the coming months.
Dan?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the word vision. We have, in retrospect, not in hindsight, but in retrospect, we may have put too much into this program too quickly. Not that it wasn't a mistake at the time, but we thought that this pandemic would V out quickly, and it doesn't look like it's going to V out quickly. It's going to be more like a W, and we're going to have to wait for that rebound. We're going to have to keep pouring government money into this. We're going to get to a point. Not that I think it's unaffordable to the Canadian people to carry a debt to GDP ratios that this is going to imply. I think it is affordable, but it is going to be very wrenching to the fabric of the country, because unfortunately we have the sort of the conservative liberal divide in this country is also a regional divide, which really troubles me. So when we decide to deal when these deficits become too big to be comfortable for the conservative element in the country, it's going to create social divisions in this country. What we need is a vision which takes us beyond that, right? And what does that vision going to look like? To me, it is to carry carry this flag of what Canada has been great at doing, and that is we are great at areas like AI and biotech. I can look and see what kinds of solutions Canada can be part of in a global context. So that's two pieces here, right? It's saying that the Canadian government initiatives are well articulated, a vision of what we want to accomplish, both for Canada and for the world, communicated effectively to Canadian people, which brings some unity to what will, I think, in another 6 months from now, become fragmentation over the large deficits. And what will that unity, what will that message look like? To me, it says Canada is going to become a sort of a curator or a concierge service to help with international collaborations on pandemic solutions. That could be on the AI space with helping to develop better contact and tracing, on testing solutions, because there are many, many testing solutions out there right now. We don't know which is going to be best. Same with vaccines. Many solutions are out there in the running. We want to stop thinking of this as a global competition, and we need Canada to help reframe this as global cooperation. My solution may not be the winner, but some solution will be the winner that helps all of us. And that's what we have to carry forward, not just for Canada, but I think for this whole planet.
Well, that's
can I interject? I think Canada, you are amazingly well positioned for this. I think, looking ahead to what companies are going to care about when they're thinking about, setting up new production facilities or new headquarters for whatever, they're going to look for countries that govern well, that can deal with the pandemic, that aren't forced to shut down their sort of entire economy because they've mismanaged it, right? If you think about who you want to do trade agreements with, well, can you keep your economy open is kind of a big, Canada, you are in amazingly, right now at least, good position to be able to take advantage of this into the future. Where I sit, we don't look very attractive right now as a reliable partner for any of these things. So congratulations and good luck.
Well, I think everybody's applauding that final comment, and what a great way to end. I wish we had another hour. But before I thank Dan and Chad, I really want to thank the audience. I mean, the number of questions and the quality of the questions have been remarkably good. I really want to thank the audience for being so engaged with those great questions. And I'll try to collect all of those questions, and maybe we'll provide some answers online, but there's so many amazing questions. But Chad and Dan, thank you so much. We know you're both incredibly busy. Thanks for preparing. And there's a lot of learnings that have jumped out. There's too many to list, but I think there's a big virtual applause going on. Thank you so much for all of that. And my closing comments, Managing Uncertainty is a weekly webinar series. I hope you can join us next week when we'll continue our look at the impact of COVID on supply chains. We'll consider a framework for disaster-proofing supply chains, a topic that flows naturally from today's conversation. If you missed any of our previous webinars, they're all available online at www.rotman.utoronto.ca. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Chad. This has been wonderful. Everybody have a great weekend, and please stay safe. Thank you.